So today we are going to be talking about 6-2.1, which is describe the development of ancient Greece culture, the Hellenic period, including the concepts of citizenship and the early forms of democracy in Athens. So one of the people that was very influential in Greece life and Greek culture was a man named Solon. He lived from 638 BC to 558 BC. And Solon was an Athenian. He lived in Athens. He was both a poet and a politician. And he was very influential in many ways. First of all, he said that no Athenian should be a slave. So at this time, a lot of Athenians may have owned other Athenians, and when he began setting the rules, he said that was no longer allowed. He also decided that social class should be based on income, not just birth. Prior to this, you were in the top class if your father was born into the top class, and you were therefore born into the top class. And Solon said that your social status, your social standing should be based on a person's income. He divided this into four different social classes based on income. So even though Solon said that Athenians should not be slaves to other Athenians, slavery was still very prominent and almost universally accepted during this time. Aristotle, in his book Politics, he said a slave is a living possession. And he later goes on to say that the rule of the free over the slave is one of nature. The slave is utterly lacks the capacity for thinking. And he goes on to talk about, to justify slavery and why slavery is okay, why men have the right to rule over women, which some would argue is just another form of slavery. It looks a little bit different. But slavery was very prominent during this time. In Athens, it was potentially a population of about 250,000, and possibly up to 100,000 people were slaves. Mostly, these were all foreigners, maybe all foreigners. And so slavery was widely accepted. The economy was very dependent on slavery at this time. So religion also played a major factor in Greek society. The Greeks were polytheists, which means that they worshipped many gods or believed in many gods. These gods were generally pretty unstable. They were pretty flippant. Sometimes they liked humans, sometimes they didn't. And so that affected a lot of the Greek attitude, the way they viewed the world and creation and everything around them. There were a lot of oracles and priests and prophets that were all part of Greek society. Priests were full-time workers, while oracles and prophets were oftentimes maybe everyday people who had occasional words from the gods. And then we have Philip of Macedon. He was a great leader, and he succeeded in conquering Athens and its allies. During this time, during his lifetime, Athens was already falling apart because of the Peloponnesian Wars. There was a lot of instability in the area, a lot of, frankly, like a lot of death, a lot of torn apart cities, a lot of war. And Philip succeeded in uniting the city-states. And he's most remembered because one of his wives gave birth to Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is arguably one of the greatest military leaders in human history. He conquered Greece to India. Basically, the entire known world was under his empire. And during this time, a lot of cities flourished, a lot of societies flourished. There was a huge emphasis on art and philosophy, literature, math and science. Libraries were built. Great cities were built. And multiculturalism was honored. There were cities like Alexandria, where Greeks and Arabs and Jews and Egyptians all lived together. During this time, women also gained some rights. Relative to what we see today in America, they still had very little rights, but women were able to appear in public more often. Oftentimes, they were encouraged to write poetry and even be philosophers. So we begin to see women gaining more rights in this culture than they had previously. So whenever you're looking at history, one of the most common questions, and rightfully so, is how does this affect me? How does this affect our society? And for Greece, I mean, this society, this culture affects us in America and the Western world so much today. We see the rise of democracy. We see an emphasis in math and science. We see a lot of scientific advancements. People talking about atoms and mathematical equations and geometry, things that had never really been talked about and things that have really advanced our society. So Greece was incredibly influential, talking about Aristotle and Plato's Republic. All of these things have enormous impacts on America today, on the formation of our government, and on how we live our lives. How we live our lives on a day-to-day basis is directly affected in many ways by how the Greeks viewed the world.